So welcome everyone to Migration Mobility's Bristol's debate on justice and labour migration, featuring Chris Bertram, who is a political philosopher, and Martin Ruhs, who is a political economist. So I'll start by just briefly introducing myself. My name is Manoj Dias-Abey, and I'm a lecturer in labour law at the University of Bristol here. I look at temporary labour migration programs in some of my research, and I tend to take what's known as a law and political economy approach. But I found and very much use the work of both Chris and Martin in some of my research. So it's a great honour to be chairing this panel session today. So for those of you who might not be aware, MMB is a specialist research institute based at the University of Bristol. It's an interdisciplinary network of scholars coming from a very broad range of disciplines, ranging from politics and sociology to film studies and law. It tries to provide sort of a creative space to engage on the issue of migration from the perspective of obviously theory, practice, and policy. So it's organized along 4 research themes, and if you're interested in learning more about MMB, please do take a look at our website. So just quickly, MMB has recently launched 2 online courses on migration, mobilities, and citizenship. One is a relatively short course you can do, and then there's a longer one as well. And if you want more information about that, either email members of the team or again, take a look at our website. I'll start by introducing the speakers, I think, up front, just so we don't spoil the flow of the debate. I'll start with Chris Bertram, who's an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Bristol and the author of a book called Do States Have the Right to Exclude Immigrants, which came out with Polity Press in 2018. So he writes about the political philosophy of migration, but he's also published quite extensively on social contract theory, Marxism, and the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's a trustee of Bristol Refugee Rights, and he blogs at Crooked Timber since 2003. Professor Martin Ruhs is a chair in migration studies and the deputy director of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence. Martin's research focuses on the economics and politics of international migration with a strong international comparative dimension. His books include The Price of Rights, Regulating International Labour Migration, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2013, and Who Needs Migrant Workers, which is an edited collection that he did with Professor Bridget Anderson. In terms of the way that we'd like to structure the discussion today, Chris and Martin will each have roughly 5 to 6 minutes to give their vision of what a just labour migration program looks like. Then each will be given roughly another 3 or 4 minutes to respond to each other. And then I get the fun task of posing some questions to them, which might take about roughly 10 minutes. We're hoping the kind of the formal part, which will be recorded, will take approximately 30 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers from the floor. If you have any questions, can you please pop them into that Q&A chat function? Emily Walmsley, who works for MMB, will be monitoring the chat. So maybe without too much further ado, I will hand the floor to Chris to begin his reflections on this question. Thank you, Chris.
Hey, thank you, Manoj. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the so-called openness rights trade-off and some of the problems with it. Well, we live in a world where extreme poverty coexists with great wealth, and where the accident of birth with one nationality rather than another has more bearing on a person's life prospects than just about anything else. And we also know that migration from poor countries to wealthy ones is more effective in addressing global poverty than just about anything else. Migrants from poor countries to wealthy ones gain access to more productive economies, earn higher wages than they would have at home, and send back valuable remittances to a degree that vastly exceeds the value of foreign aid programs. And meanwhile, wealthy countries like ours need migrant labour to do the jobs that too few of our own citizens will do, in agriculture and food, social care, health, construction, hospitality. And actually, those are the jobs that once were pretty invisible, but which COVID has brought home the value of to a high degree. But migration is also a hot button electoral issue, and nativist parties have enjoyed great success in promoting restrictionist policies that pander to anti-immigrant sentiment. In response to this conflict between what's economically desirable for both sides and what's politically palatable to electorates, some economists have argued for the idea of a trade-off between openness and rights, suggesting that we can make the labour migration that we need more palatable to electorates to the extent to which the inferior and temporary status of those migrants is made concrete by depriving them of various rights. And here migration's conceived of very much in transactional terms. We get a flexible and exploitable labour force, perhaps plugging key skills gaps, whereas they get more money and voters don't feel threatened that these incomers will displace them in their own country. Notice that the argument contains the assumption that states are entitled to exclude immigrants in general or to admit them at their discretion, and that they're entitled to discriminate among would-be migrants on grounds of their usefulness. Since such assumptions are pretty widely shared, perhaps they're pragmatically a reasonable assumption for discussing policy. However, it's worth at least noting that many people, including me, contest these assumptions as a matter of political morality, even though our contestation may not make much difference in reality. Okay, so this openness rights trade-off argument, there are different versions of it, but the argument in general, I think, can be challenged on two levels, on the level of facts and on the level of principles. I'm going to concentrate mainly on the principles, but on the facts, I note that a lot of the evidence for this openness rights trade-off comes from undemocratic countries such as the Gulf states and Singapore. So we need to be wary of how far it generalizes to democratic ones. And second, that insofar as opposition to migration in wealthy countries is based on the perception, however misguided, that cheap foreign labor somehow threatens wages and jobs, it's hard to see how that opposition is going to be assuaged by increasing the numbers of rightless and exploitable people in the labor force. The principles can cover, I think, two basic areas, which I'll group as exploitation and democracy. The exploitation point is surely familiar. If we put people in a weaker bargaining position by denying them options, we make them more vulnerable to those who would take advantage of them. So, for example, if we tie people to one employer or one line of employment and make it harder for them to walk out, we make it easier for employers or managers to threaten them for not working unpaid overtime, to get them to put up with hazardous working conditions, or for refusing to give in to sexual demands, for example. Still, there's a familiar response, which we know from debates on sweatshops or sex work. These people are making a choice to accept employment on these terms, and we risk disrespecting their agency and denying them the chance to be better off than they otherwise would be if we close off a route to employment that wouldn't exist but for these rights restrictions. The democracy point kicks in for anyone who thinks it's wrong to have people living and working on the territory being subject to laws but having no say over them. Now, some economists believe that we can get around this objection by giving people only short-term visas, so temporary workers, treated in this respect as if they're a bit like mere tourists, aren't around long enough to develop a claim to membership. But even if workers themselves aren't individually wronged by such a policy, there's an issue about a democratic society in which a lot of the productive activity is carried out by people without political rights, and in which others, who may not be working at all, have disproportionate weight in political decision-making. In fact, I worry that in the circumstances where we will, because of labour shortages and demographic changes, need migrant workers anyway, the openness rights trade-off argument can be used as a kind of alibi for denying workers' rights and installing a permanent two-tier society. Finally, I think there's an issue around the framing of this openness rights trade-off. As presented, the policy is one of producing the best outcome in global terms, subject to a constraint, that constraint being the attitudes of wealthy country electorates. But if immigration policy is a matter of our collective choice, after all, the wealthy country electorates are us, then we can't represent ourselves as doing the best thing when doing an even better thing is within our power. So if it's true that being more open to migrant labour helps alleviate global poverty, that's a policy that we could choose without forcing unpalatable choices on those migrant workers. We could admit them without submitting them to precarious terms that expose them to domination and exploitation. We simply choose not to, and we shouldn't make out that when we do that, we're doing the right thing. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. Martin, can I ask you to make your first round of comments, please?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I think it's a very timely debate because in Europe, of course, there's renewed interest in legal labor migration pathways, opening up especially routes for lower skilled migrants. And obviously labor migration is of huge relevance to debates about Brexit and the post-Brexit immigration system. And a lot of the debates actually are not about the impacts of migrants, but much more about the underlying ethical issues. So I think that's why it's really important that we discuss these. And it's obviously primarily about value and not so much about facts, which means that there isn't one right starting point. So I'll briefly outline some of the principles that inform my own thinking on this. So these are not yet concrete policies, but more kind of broad principles. And I suppose, first of all, just to be clear, when I think about the labor immigration policy, I think about a policy that has to do three things, which is regulate the scale of immigration, so how many people are admitted, selection, so do you, for example, give preference to more highly skilled workers over lower skilled workers, and the rights that migrants get after admission. So in the question how we should approach this from a normative perspective, I start with kind of a well-known distinction within political theory. I'm not a political theorist, so this will be well known to most people. But a distinction between what Joseph Cairns called realistic and idealistic approaches to the ethics of migration. The difference being that ideal approaches, or idealistic approaches, refer to theorizing that does not pay attention to realities on the ground. So it's independent of that, whereas a realistic approach starts from certain realities. And what I do is try to take a combination, but I'm really probably closer to the realistic side. So in a way, the aim is to inform real world policy debates. So I take certain things as given. And I think actually Chris takes similar things as given. So the existence of nation states and the right to control immigration. And then I think I would have kind of five broad principles, which I'll briefly run through. I mean, they're quite broad and we can talk about the details later. I do think as a first principle is that I think there needs to be an acceptance of the need for labor migration policies, which are made and implemented by nation states or by states to prioritize the interests of the citizens of those states. So in a way, this is all I'm saying here is that governments need to give at least some preference in their policy making to the interests of citizens or even a broader group of residents compared to people who are not in their countries. Second principle is I think there's a very strong moral duty to actively promote the interests of prospective migrants and their countries of origin. According to the World Bank, there is no more effective strategy for raising the incomes of people in poor countries than giving them a job in a rich country. Lower skilled migration is much more restricted than more highly skilled migration at the moment. So I think from a global justice point of view, there's a strong case for thinking about policies that liberalize low skilled labor migration. So I think most countries of labor migration currently give very little weight to the interests of sending countries or of those outside their borders when deciding on their labor immigration policies. I think there's a strong moral case for paying much more attention to that. A third principle would be that, I mean, again, it's an obvious one, is that I think human rights principles and principles of equality, I think, carry very strong weight, and any consideration of going away from some of those principles, for example, the principle of equality, would need very good justification. I mean, as I'll explain later, some restrictions of certain fundamental human rights I would consider totally unacceptable. But there are other restrictions of rights that I would find acceptable, but only if they're very good justifications. And I'll explain what I mean that a little bit later. So I think respecting rights and equality is fundamentally important. But my fourth principle is, I think we shouldn't only be focused on the protection of rights when thinking about how we evaluate labor immigration policies. Why? Because rights are not the only dimension of human development. Migration obviously has other types of effects on economies, on the economic well-being, on the social well-being of people. So I do think we need to see this in a multidimensional way and also consider the other types of effects that migration has. So really, all of that implies that I think there are no easy choices in labor immigration policy. In my view, all morally desirable labor immigration policies must involve at least some balancing of rights and consequences, and a balancing of the interests of citizens and non-citizens. So that isn't just the same as saying I'm in the middle, or some sort of centrist cop-out. I mean, I genuinely believe that these are very difficult questions, and it's very hard to kind of be in the corner, kind of argue the corner solution, that we only need to think about rights, or as some economists would do, we only need to think about consequences, or we only think about us, or everybody in the world is the same when it comes to the responsibilities of governments in terms of labor immigration policy. And finally, the fifth principle that I would propose is, I don't think that we can think of a one-size-fits-all approach, because I think there are some principles and some policies that I would advocate for all countries, but I think there are also nuances. So the kinds of rights, I think, that are defensible to restrict will vary a little bit across countries depending on some of the contexts. So depending on, for example, on some of their welfare systems and maybe also their political systems. And finally, my final point is that, coming back to this idea of taking a realistic approach, when we talk about labor immigration policies, we are essentially talking about temporary labor migration programs. And I define a temporary labor migration program as a policy that admits people with temporary residence and work permits. And after some time, some of these programs allow people to transfer to permanent status. Some other programs don't allow that. But the way I define such programs is by the status upon admission. And almost all labor immigration programs in the world, and this is an important point, almost all of them are temporary labor immigration programs. There used to be permanent programs, points-based systems in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Those still exist, but they have become much smaller than the temporary migration programs. And there are very few countries who operate points-based systems that impose permanent residence status, or that grant permanent residence status on arrival. So in my view, the question about the ethics of labor migration is not really whether or not temporary migration programs are acceptable. I think if you want to take a realistic approach, you have to talk about temporary migration programs. But the key question is really, how do you design them? And as Chris said, what kind of rights restrictions under such programs are acceptable and which ones are not acceptable?
Great. Thank you, Martin. I think both speakers have very eloquently set out the sort of the basic thrust of their argument. Now I would like to invite Chris to respond to Martin's comments, please.
Okay, so Martin raised many kind of interesting points. One thing I'd like to just kind of mention and draw attention to is, Martin made this distinction, which is very salient to us, between citizens and non-citizens. and also talked about, permanent residence or immigration leading to permanent residence versus temporary labor programs. Now, one of the kind of issues that I think we have to kind of look to is where the boundary lies between citizens and non-citizens. Because, obviously, countries have their nationality laws. They admit people to citizenship or permanent residency or not. But we also have to look to the extent to which people have a claim to those statuses, whether or not governments actually give them a path to those statuses. Now, with temporary labor migration programs, you can have, phenomena where you have a lot of people who are present on the territory for a long period of time, who are perhaps functionally members of society, perhaps they're starting to put down roots, perhaps they've entered into kind of relationships with other members of those societies, and their kind of non-citizen outsider status is already starting to look somewhat blurred. So I don't think we can just kind of take that division between citizens and non-citizens as a given. I think if we're kind of thinking about the kind of society that we want to live in, and who has a right to membership, who has a right to a political voice in that society, we also have to kind of problematize some of the kind of formal paths that are available to citizenship as things are now. So that was one kind of thing I wanted to just point to in response to Martin. The other was, well, yes, so most labor migration programs these days are temporary labor programs, but in the past we've had such programs and they've often led to permanent migration of people. So thinking about the German kind of Gastarbeiter programs of the 1970s, they were intended as kind of temporary stopgaps, but actually they've led to the emergence of a population of Turkish and Yugoslav origin on the territory of Germany. So what's intended as temporary doesn't necessarily end up as temporary. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Martin, would you like to have a chance to respond to some of the stuff that Chris put forward?
Thank you. Yeah, just to clarify, so based on the principles that I described earlier, I mean, I basically am sympathetic to temporary migration programs, especially for medium and lower skilled migrant workers, that would enable a larger number of people in the world to access the labor markets of higher income countries. So I think all temporary migration programs restrict at least some rights of migrant workers. They enable people to access jobs at higher wages, but at the price of restricted rights. So I think the question is, what rights restrictions are acceptable in my view. Coming to Chris's points briefly, I agree that the terminology is not satisfactory. The simple distinction between citizens and non-citizens is not enough. I think what I have in mind is there's some fundamental distinction between newcomers and those who are here and have stronger claims vis-a-vis the state. On the feasibility of temporary migration programs, yes, you're right. One of the lessons of the past has been that it's been very difficult to keep such programs temporary, and there's been a big research literature about this. My response to this has generally been, it doesn't necessarily mean that those programs don't work, but we need to think about policies that achieve higher rates of return. Maybe there are different types of incentives that can be provided other than just effective enforcement, which we know is difficult for various reasons, enforcing return, but incentives that can provide more temporariness and greater circulation. We can talk about that later as well in terms of specifics. Now, I do want to come back on one point that Chris brought up in his discussion of this idea of openness versus rights. and if I understood Chris correctly, his argument was that it is not legitimate to make this trade-off if the key obstacle for greater admission is actually the attitudes, our attitudes which basically are against admitting larger numbers. I think the argument goes beyond just people's attitudes. I think the argument, one, has to do with economic incentives, also of employers. So the example that I usually give is, should migrants who are admitted under temporary migration programs be given free choice of employment in the host country's labor market, or should their employment be restricted to specific sectors or even employers? Now, in practice, it's often restricted to specific employers, which gives rise to exploitation very often, which is problematic. But my argument is this: I think there has to be some restriction, at least to the sector or to an occupation, because otherwise the host country's incentive for admitting migrants in the first place might be much reduced. Much labor migration happens these days because countries think they have shortages in particular sectors or labor markets. So they might have a shortage in agriculture or in the care sector. And the idea is to use labor migration, temporary labor migration programs, to meet shortages in those sectors, but not in other sectors where there might not be a shortage. So, if you cannot restrict migrants' employment to particular occupations, then you cannot meet shortages in those areas, because migrants might decide they'd rather work somewhere else because, for example, wages are better, employment conditions are better. So I think this is an example of where the point is not so much that we need to restrict this right because there's some reason why we don't want to give migrants equal employment rights, but it's an economic consideration which simply says that if you insist on granting migrants full access to the labor market on day one, then I think individual employers' incentives, but also the host country's incentive to admit migrant workers will be much reduced. So it's not just about attitudes. I think it's about economics, and I think it's about the politics more broadly, and about the role of kind of fiscal effects, and also about fundamental values that people have. So one thing, and I'll finish with that maybe, when we look at surveys of people's values with regard to migrants and migrants' rights, what we do see is that across countries, there's a fairly common finding that the migrants' rights should increase over time. But there are some rights where people feel that there should not be equality on day one between newcomers and those who are here, citizens and others. And basically, migrants contribute, for example, and they earn their rights over time. So this is not just an attitude. I think this is more of a fundamental belief around fairness that exists in many countries. And I think if that belief is violated in some way through a policy that grants equal rights with regard to certain rights, I think that can create political difficulties for having such programs in the first place. So my concern is with creating policies that actually open up high-income countries' labor markets to enable more migrants, more workers from low-income countries to get accepted and work here.
Great. Thank you both. I think everyone would agree that you've done a really great job of putting forward your arguments. And they're quite complex arguments in the extremely brief time that we've given you to do it. Now we have some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, I can already see a couple of questions appearing. Please do pop them in the Q&A box. But I'm going to exercise my prerogatives as chair to pose 2 questions, and I will restrict myself to 2 questions. One question for you, Chris, and then followed by a question for you, Martin. Perhaps since Chris, you went first, I will ask you my question of you now. So I think you've made a strong case for why the trade-off argument is deeply problematic. But Chris, would you be able to outline for us what your vision of a just labor migration policy or program would look like?
Right. So So my view, so I have a kind of a big picture view about justice and migration. And that looks to having a system of kind of global governance for migration and mobility. So that would move away from the system we have at the moment, which is a system where individual states have the right to set their migration policy as they like and to reject people or accept people as they choose. So obviously, though we don't live in a world that's anything like my ideal, but I do think that states should act now in various respects to try to move towards that ideal. So they should be kind of working with other states to put in place, conventions and international instruments and so on. We already have quite a lot of those to govern migration and mobility. And they should be upholding those aspects of the current kind of global legal order that serve justice. So I'm thinking about things like the Refugee Convention and so on. We're not sort of really talking about that today. So basically, I'm in favor of moving to a world where there's a lot, where we have a lot more open migration, where it's perhaps not open borders exactly, but it's a world where restrictions on mobility have to be justifiable to everybody, including to people who live in kind of non-wealthy countries and perhaps who want to move. So if you're asking about sort of my ideal picture, that's kind of it. But Martin's raised this issue of the kind of realism, kind of idealism spectrum, and has rightly said, okay, we have to take certain things as given when we're kind of working out what our policy should be. And I think as a matter of practical politics, that's undeniably the case. But I would kind of push for a system really that's as open as possible. I mean, Martin raised this question, okay, about restricting workers to particular sectors. And I recall a few years ago when the restrictions on employment, I think of workers from Bulgaria and Romania were dropped, which meant that workers from those countries had kind of wide access to the labour market in the UK, and they weren't just confined to, say, the agricultural sector. And people who had kind of daffodil growing farms or fruit or apple orchards or whatever in the West Country were concerned at that time that all these Bulgarians and Romanians who'd been working for them would now disappear into the wider economy, and they'd have to pay higher wages to those people. And I guess at the time my reaction was, well, perhaps the wages you're paying then aren't high enough if you can't retain those people in those jobs. So yes, ideally I would want something that's a lot more open than what we have now.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Martin, my question to you, I think your vision of a labor migration program obviously involves some sort of prioritization of rights. And my understanding of how you proceed with sort of prioritizing those rights is to sort of carve out this area of political and civil rights, which certainly need to be granted, and then leave aside some social rights, at least on a time-limited basis. But I think that distinction between political and civil rights and social rights, on the other hand, elides some complexity, because you've characterized the right to choice of employment as a social right, and it's not entirely clear whether that would be a correct characterization. But what I would ask you is there a sort of a rather than what you call a realistic approach to the prioritization of rights, is there a principal approach for ranking the rights that we give migrant workers and determining the kind of the permissible time limits if we were to restrict them?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, indeed. So I mean, when we think about the broad human rights-based approach, people often talk about the indivisibility of rights, universality of rights, and inalienability of rights. And of course, I would, as I said before, when we talk about fundamental human rights, we need to discuss what those rights are, but many people would agree what a fundamental rights should be. I think these need to be respected under any circumstances. But then if you're asking yourself, for example, are some rights more important in terms of protecting migrants' well-being? Are some rights restrictions leading to greater degrees of exploitations? In my view, the answer certainly yes. So that leads me to indeed think about whether some rights are much more fundamental in terms of protecting them and their equality, the principle of equality, than others. And as you say, civil and political rights, I think in a liberal democracy are fundamental. I would say labor rights, except for the right to free choice of employment. I would classify that as a labor right. Typically, it is considered a labor right. I think that's the only right where I would tolerate restrictions. In terms of the other rights, I think there needs to be equality, because as Chris also said, if you bring in migrant workers under reduced rights, they might actually become more of a competition to domestic workers rather than less of a competition, because they're effectively cheaper workers. So I do think most of the debate is really, as you said, about social rights, and that is access to the welfare state. So the idea there is that, I mean, one way of thinking about it is that access to welfare in some way, there are already hierarchies within the welfare state, even among different groups of citizens in different circumstances. And, you know, well, there's general retrenchment sometimes of welfare states. Different groups are given more rights, fewer rights. So I think that entitlements to full equality of welfare is something, in my view, that's quite fundamentally different from labor rights and civil and political rights. So, and I think this, in terms of debate about migration and welfare state, this is where a lot of opposition to more labor immigration comes from, which is why I would say temporary restrictions of some of those rights, I think, would be, of some of these social rights, would be acceptable in my view, especially of rights to means-tested welfare programs, not to contributory welfare schemes, because I think it would be fundamentally unfair to restrict those rights. But some selected restriction to social rights, I think, would be. So this is why maybe I'll include on that. I mean, my debate with some international organizations has been that rather than just insisting on equality of all types of rights for migrants, as the 1990 Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers does, why don't we have, in addition to that, a shorter list of core rights that we promote for migrant workers? This would be complementary. It wouldn't dilute the bigger list, but it would simply make the point that there are some fundamental rights that really need to be protected at all times and under any circumstances. A bit like the ILO did in the 1990s, I believe, where it published its fundamental labor conventions. It didn't mean that the ILO's other conventions became meaningless. It just said, look, we just remind everybody and emphasize that there are some fundamental rights. And I think in migration at a global level, migration governance, I think we really need something very similar. In addition to the long list that we all aspire to, in terms of practicalities and real world politics as a first step, I think it would be very helpful to have a shorter list of core rights for migrants, which in my view should include civil, political, and most labor rights, but perhaps not all social rights.
Great. Thank you, Martin. I can see several questions appearing in the Q&A chat box now.